Dog says goodbye to the vet before euthanasia. And the vet screams desperately. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a sterile glow on the rows of cages lining the concrete floor. The air hung heavy with the mingled scents of disinfectant, dog food, and that underlying, faintly sour odor that Sarah was beginning to associate with animal shelters. She sighed, tucking a stray strand of graying hair behind her ear, and adjusted her ill-fitting uniform. 1 month she'd been working at the Happy Tales animal shelter, and already the initial optimism that had propelled her through the doors was starting to fray at the edges. It wasn't the animals, of course. Sarah had always had a soft spot for creatures of all shapes and sizes. Growing up on a small farm in Ohio, she'd been surrounded by dogs, cats, horses, even the occasional mischievous raccoon that managed to sneak into the barn. But life had a way of sidelining passions, and somewhere between marriage, raising 2 kids, and a divorce that had left her emotionally and financially drained, her love for animals had become a distant memory. Now, at 52, with her kids grown and flown the nest, Sarah found herself adrift. The divorce had forced her to sell the family home and move into a cramped apartment, and the part-time job at the local library barely covered the bills. When she saw the ad for a full-time position at Happy Tales, with its promise of decent pay and benefits, she jumped at the opportunity. The reality, however, was proving to be less than idyllic. Happy Tales was a large, underfunded, and somewhat chaotic establishment. The staff seemed perpetually overworked and underappreciated, and a pervasive air of cynicism hung over the place like a shroud. Sarah, with her gentle nature and idealistic notions about animal welfare, felt like a dandelion in a patch of weeds. Her colleagues, a motley crew of hardened shelter veterans and indifferent teenagers earning extra cash, seemed to view the animals as inventory rather than living beings. There was Mrs. Jenkins, the stern-faced supervisor with a voice like nails on a chalkboard, who ran the shelter with an iron fist and a seemingly endless supply of rules and regulations. Then there was Brenda, the receptionist, a woman whose primary interest seemed to be gossiping about her coworkers and reapplying her lipstick every 5 minutes. And of course, there were the kennel workers, a rotating cast of mostly sullen teenagers who went about their duties with the enthusiasm of slugs. Sarah tried to connect with them, to share her enthusiasm for the animals, but her attempts were usually met with blank stares or sarcastic comments. "You'll get over it." One of the kennel workers, a lanky youth with a nose ring and a permanent scowl, had told her on her first day, "After a while they're just dogs." But to Sarah, they weren't just dogs. Each one had a story, a personality, a spark of life that deserved to be recognized and cherished, and none more so than Champ. Champ was an old German shepherd, his once majestic black and tan coat now faded and streaked with gray. He spent most of his days huddled in the corner of his kennel, his cloudy eyes fixed on some unseen point in the distance. His movements were slow and labored, his joints stiff with age and something more, something Sarah couldn't quite put her finger on. She'd noticed him on her second day. His labored gait and the way he winced with each step tugging at her heartstrings. She'd asked one of the kennel workers about him, hoping to learn his story. "Oh, that's Champ," the girl replied with a shrug. "He's been here forever. Nobody wants him. Too old, too grumpy." "Is he in pain?" Sarah had asked, her concern growing. The girl had snorted. "Probably. They all are at that age. He's on the list, though. Soon." "The list?" "Yeah, you know the list." The girl had rolled her eyes, as if Sarah were an idiot. "The euthanasia list." Sarah's stomach had clenched. She'd known, of course, that shelters sometimes had to resort to euthanasia, but the casual way the girl had said it, the lack of empathy in her voice, had chilled her to the bone. From that moment on, Champ had become her special project. She spent her breaks with him, talking to him in soft tones, gently stroking his grizzled head. He seemed to appreciate the attention, leaning into her touch and occasionally thumping his tail weakly against the concrete floor. One day, she brought him a special treat, a can of gourmet dog food she'd splurged on at the pet store. As he ate, she'd noticed the way he favored his left front leg, the subtle tremor that ran through his body. "What happened to you, Champ?" she'd murmured, her fingers tracing the bony outline of his shoulder. What have you been through? She was determined to find out. The next morning, Sarah arrived at Happy Tales armed with a plan. She'd spent the previous evening researching local veterinarians, looking for one who might be willing to examine Champ pro bono or at a reduced rate. She'd finally found a promising lead, a Dr. Emily Carter, whose website mentioned a special interest in geriatric animal care and a commitment to community outreach. Sarah approached Mrs. Jenkins, her stomach churning with nerves. Mrs. Jenkins, she began, trying to keep her voice steady. I'm a bit concerned about Champ, the old German Shepherd. He seems to be in a lot of pain, and I was wondering if we could get him seen by a vet. Mrs. Jenkins, who was busy scrutinizing a spreadsheet with a frown that could curdle milk, looked up impatiently. Champ, isn't he on the list? Yes, but... Sarah hesitated, unsure how to phrase her request. I just think it would be humane to have him checked out before. You know, Mrs. Jenkins let out a sigh that seemed to deflate Sarah's hopes like a punctured balloon. Sarah, she said, her voice laced with weary condescension. We appreciate your concern, but we have limited resources. We can't afford to spend money on extensive veterinary care for an animal that's going to be euthanized anyway. But what if something can be done? Sarah persisted. What if it's something treatable? Mrs. Jenkins gave her a withering look. Sarah, Champ is an old dog. He's been here for 5 years. Nobody wants him. He's probably got arthritis, hip dysplasia, maybe even cancer. It's not our responsibility to prolong his suffering. Sarah felt a surge of anger, but she forced herself to remain calm. I understand that, but wouldn't it be better to be sure? I found a vet who might be willing to examine him for free, or at least at a reduced cost. Dr. Emily Carter at the Animal Care Clinic. Mrs. Jenkins pursed her lips, her frown deepening. Dr. Carter, isn't she that young woman who's always going on about animal rights and whatnot? She's a very experienced veterinarian, Sarah said, trying to ignore the dismissive tone. And she seems to be genuinely compassionate. Mrs. Jenkins hesitated, her gaze flickering back to the spreadsheet. Sarah held her breath, hoping against hope that she might relent. Finally, Mrs. Jenkins let out a grudging sigh. Fine, she said, her voice sharp, but this is a one-time thing. If Dr. Carter finds anything that requires expensive treatment, we're not paying for it. Is that clear? Perfectly clear, Sarah said, trying to hide her relief. Thank you, Mrs. Jenkins. She practically flew to the kennel area, her heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. Champ was lying in his usual corner, his eyes closed. Sarah knelt beside him, gently stroking his fur. Champ, she whispered. We might have a chance. Later that afternoon, Sarah found herself sitting in Dr. Carter's brightly lit examination room, her anxiety growing with each passing minute. Dr. Carter, a petite woman with kind eyes and a warm smile, had been nothing but welcoming and professional. She'd examined Champ thoroughly, her touch gentle and reassuring. Now, she was studying the X-rays on the light board, her brow furrowed in concentration. Well, she said finally, turning to Sarah. Champ is definitely an old gentleman, and he does have some arthritis, as you suspected. But that's not the main issue. Sarah's heart sank. What is it then? Dr. Carter pointed to a spot on the X-ray. See this here? This deformity in his left shoulder blade. It's an old injury, probably a fracture that wasn't treated properly. It's healed, but it's left him with limited mobility and chronic pain. Sarah felt a wave of sadness wash over her. So there's nothing that can be done? Dr. Carter shook her head. I'm afraid not. At this stage, surgery is too risky. We can manage the pain with medication, but it won't cure the underlying problem. Sarah looked at Champ, who was lying patiently on the examination table, his tail giving a feeble thump against the stainless steel. She felt a surge of anger, not at Dr. Carter, but at the unknown person who had inflicted this pain on him, and at the shelter that had neglected him for so long. How long has he been like this? She asked, her voice trembling. Dr. Carter shrugged. It's hard to say for sure, but judging by the extent of the healing, I'd say the injury is at least several years old. Several years. Several years of pain, of discomfort, of being ignored and discarded. Sarah felt tears pricking her eyes. "Thank you, Dr. Carter," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I appreciate you taking the time to see him. It was my pleasure." Dr. Carter said, her smile genuine. "He's a sweet old boy. He deserves to be comfortable." As Sarah drove Champ back to the shelter, she couldn't shake the feeling of injustice. Champ, this gentle, loving creature, had been through so much, and now he was facing his final days in a place that seemed more concerned with statistics than with compassion. She knew she had to do something. But what? Back at the shelter, Sarah found Mrs. Jenkins in her office, hunched over her paperwork as usual. She took a deep breath and knocked tentatively on the door. "Come in," Mrs. Jenkins barked, her voice sharp. Sarah stepped inside, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "Mrs. Jenkins," she began, "I took Champ to Dr. Carter as you allowed." Mrs. Jenkins looked up, her expression impatient. "And, well," Sarah said, trying to choose her words carefully. "Dr. Carter confirmed that he has arthritis, but she also found something else." Mrs. Jenkins sighed dramatically. "What is it now? Does he need surgery?" "I told you we can't afford." "No, it's not that," Sarah interrupted. "Dr. Carter found an old injury, a fracture in his shoulder blade that wasn't treated properly. It's healed, but it's causing him a lot of pain." Mrs. Jenkins frowned. "An old injury? How old?" "Dr. Carter said it could be several years old," Sarah replied, her voice trembling with suppressed anger. "She thinks it happened before he came to the shelter." A flicker of something that might have been concerning crossed Mrs. Jenkins's face, but it was quickly replaced by her usual mask of indifference. "Well, that's unfortunate," she said, her tone dismissive, "but it doesn't change anything. He's still an old dog with a lot of health problems. We can't keep him here indefinitely." "But he's in pain," Sarah exclaimed, her voice rising in frustration. "Don't you see? He's been suffering for years, and nobody did anything about it." Mrs. Jenkins's frown deepened. "Sarah, I understand you're upset, but you need to calm down. We have procedures in place for a reason. We can't make exceptions for every animal with a sad story." "But this isn't just a sad story," Sarah cried, her voice cracking. "This is neglect. This is abuse. He was probably hurt by someone, and then he ended up here, and nobody even bothered to find out what was wrong with him." Mrs. Jenkins's face hardened. "That's enough, Sarah. You're overstepping your bounds. I don't need a lecture from a new employee who doesn't understand how things work around here." Sarah felt tears welling up in her eyes, but she blinked them back. "I understand how things work here," she said, her voice low and trembling. "And that's exactly what's wrong. You're so focused on rules and regulations that you've forgotten what it means to care for these animals. Champ has been suffering for years, and you're just going to discard him like a broken toy." Mrs. Jenkins rose from her chair, her face flushed with anger. "You're out of line, Sarah. I'm warning you. If you continue with this insubordination, you'll be written up." Sarah took a deep breath, her heart pounding. She knew she was risking her job, but she couldn't stay silent any longer. "Write me up then," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "I don't care. I won't stand by and watch while you condemn a helpless animal to a painful death." She turned and walked out of the office, leaving Mrs. Jenkins sputtering in her wake. As she strode through the shelter, her anger gradually gave way to a deep sense of despair. She tried to do the right thing, to speak up for Champ, but she'd been met with indifference and hostility. What could she do now? Later that day, Sarah found herself drawn back to Champ's kennel. He was lying in his usual corner, his eyes closed, his breathing shallow. Sarah knelt beside him, her fingers gently stroking his fur. "I'm so sorry, Champ," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. I really tried." As she sat there, lost in her grief and frustration, a thought occurred to her. Dr. Carter had mentioned that Champ's injury was old, probably several years old. That meant it likely happened before he came to the shelter. But how did he end up at the shelter in the first place? Was he abandoned? Was he astray? A sudden surge of determination coursed through her. She had to find out. Maybe, just maybe, there was still a chance to save Champ, or at least to give him some peace in his final days. She left the kennel area and headed towards the shelter's records room. She'd never been in there before, but she knew it was where they kept the files on all the animals. Maybe Champ's file would contain some clues about his past. The records room was a small, dusty space crammed with filing cabinets. Sarah found Champ's file and pulled it out. She flipped through the pages, her heart sinking as she read the sparse notes. Found stray, estimated age 7 years. No collar or microchip. Unclaimed after a holding period. There was nothing about his injury, nothing about his past. Sarah was about to give up when she noticed a small, faded photograph stapled to the back of the file. It showed Champ as a younger dog, his coat glossy and black, his eyes bright and alert. He was standing next to a man, a middle-aged man with a kind face and a baseball cap. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. Could this be Champ's previous owner? Was this the key to unlocking his past? The photograph was like a lifeline, a tangible connection to Champ's past. Sarah stared at it, her mind racing. Who was this man? Where was he now? Did he know what had happened to Champ? A surge of hope coursed through her. Maybe, just maybe, this man could provide the answers she was searching for. Maybe he could even help Champ. She carefully removed the photograph from the file and tucked it into her pocket. She would need to do some digging, find out who this man was and how to contact him. But first, she had to deal with the more immediate problem: Champ's impending euthanasia. Sarah returned to Mrs. Jenkins's office, her resolve strengthened by the discovery of the photograph. She knocked on the door, her knuckles rapping firmly against the wood. "Come in." Mrs. Jenkins's voice sounded weary, resigned. Sarah stepped inside, the photograph clutched tightly in her hand. "Mrs. Jenkins," she said, her voice firm, "I need to talk to you about Champ." Mrs. Jenkins sighed, rubbing her temples with her fingers. "Sarah, I thought we were done with this." "We're not done," Sarah countered, her voice rising. "I've been doing some thinking, and I've come to a decision." Mrs. Jenkins looked up, her eyebrows raised in surprise. "And what decision is that?" "I'm taking Champ," Sarah declared, her voice ringing with determination. "I'm taking him home with me." Mrs. Jenkins stared at her, her mouth agape. "You're what?" "I'm adopting him," Sarah repeated, her voice unwavering. "I know he's old, and he has health problems, but I'm not going to let you euthanize him. He deserves better than that." Mrs. Jenkins sputtered. But, the rules, the procedures, you can't just." "I can," Sarah interrupted, her voice firm, "and I will. I'll sign whatever papers you need. I'll pay any fees, but Champ is coming home with me." Mrs. Jenkins seemed to deflate, her shoulders slumping. "Sarah," she said, her voice softer now, almost pleading, "you don't understand. This is a shelter. We have limited space, limited resources. We have to make difficult decisions." "I understand that," Sarah said, her voice softening as well. "But Champ isn't just a number. He's a living being who deserves compassion and care, and I'm willing to give him that." Mrs. Jenkins was silent for a moment, her gaze fixed on the desk in front of her. Finally, she looked up, her eyes meeting Sarah's. "You're a stubborn woman, Sarah," she said, a hint of grudging admiration in her voice. "I prefer determined," Sarah corrected her with a small smile. Mrs. Jenkins sighed. "Fine," she said, reaching for a stack of forms. "Fill these out, and be aware that you're taking on a big responsibility. Champ is an old dog, and he's going to need a lot of care." "I know," Sarah said, her heart swelling with a mixture of relief and excitement, "and I'm ready for it." Later that day, Sarah walked out of Happy Tales with Champ by her side. He walked slowly, his gait still stiff, but there was a new lightness in his step, a spark of hope in his eyes. As they drove away, Sarah glanced in the rearview mirror, her gaze lingering on the shelter building. She felt a pang of sadness for the other animals left behind, but also a surge of determination. She would be back. She would fight for them too. But for now, her focus was on Champ. He was finally safe, finally loved. And as she looked at the old dog beside her, his head resting on her lap, his tail thumping gently against the seat, she knew she had made the right decision. Sarah's small apartment felt strangely spacious with Champ in it. He explored his new surroundings cautiously, his tail wagging tentatively as he sniffed at the furniture and rugs. Sarah had prepared a cozy bed for him in the corner of the living room, and he gratefully settled into it, his old bones sighing with relief. Life with Champ was a mixture of joy and heartache. Sarah delighted in taking him for slow walks in the park, watching him sniff at the grass and bask in the sunshine. She cooked him special meals, brushed his fur until it gleamed, and spent hours talking to him, sharing her hopes and fears, her dreams and disappointments. But there were also difficult moments. Champ's arthritis flared up on cold days, making his movements stiff and painful. He had accidents in the house, his aging bladder no longer as reliable as it once was, and there were nights when he would whimper in his sleep, haunted by memories of a past that Sarah could only imagine. Through it all, Sarah never regretted her decision to take him in. She knew his time was limited, but she was determined to make his remaining days as comfortable and happy as possible. She took him to Dr. Carter for regular checkups, and she followed the vet's instructions meticulously, administering his medication and ensuring he got plenty of rest. But despite her best efforts, Champ's health continued to decline. His walks became shorter, his naps longer. He lost his appetite, and his once bright eyes grew cloudy and distant. One evening, as Sarah sat beside his bed, stroking his fur, she knew the end was near. Champ's breathing was shallow and labored, his body racked with tremors. She called Dr. Carter, who arrived shortly afterward. Dr. Carter examined Champ gently, her face etched with sadness. "Sarah," she said softly, "I think it's time." Sarah nodded, tears streaming down her face. She knew there was no other choice. Champ was suffering, and it was time to let him go. She held Champ close as Dr. Carter administered the injection. His breathing slowed, his tremors subsided, and then he was gone. Sarah wept, her body racked with sobs. She had known this day was coming, but nothing could have prepared her for the pain of losing him. She buried Champ in a quiet corner of the park. Beneath a spreading oak tree, she placed his favorite toy, a worn tennis ball, on top of the grave, and she whispered a final goodbye. The days that followed were a blur of grief and emptiness. Sarah's apartment felt unbearably silent without Champ's soft snores and the gentle thump of his tail against the floor. She missed his presence, his warmth, his unconditional love. She returned to work at Happy Tales, but the place felt different now. The sight of the empty kennels, the sound of barking dogs, only served to remind her of her loss. She went through the motions of her job, but her heart wasn't in it. One evening, as she sat alone in her apartment, staring at Champ's empty bed, she decided she couldn't stay there any longer. The memories were too painful, the silence too deafening. She packed her bags and left, leaving behind the ghosts of her past and the pain of her loss. She didn't know where she was going, but she knew she had to start over, to find a new purpose, a new beginning. Sarah drove aimlessly for hours, the highway stretching out before her like an endless ribbon of asphalt. She had no destination in mind, no plan, no purpose. All she knew was that she couldn't stay in that apartment, surrounded by the ghosts of her past. As the miles rolled by, her grief gradually gave way to a simmering anger. Anger at the shelter, at Mrs. Jenkins, at the system that had failed Champ. He had suffered for years, neglected and forgotten, and in the end, he had been denied even the dignity of a peaceful passing. Sarah's hands tightened on the steering wheel, her knuckles white. She couldn't let Champ's story end like this. She had to do something, to speak out, to make sure that no other animal suffered the same fate. She pulled over at a rest stop and took out her laptop. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, fueled by a mixture of grief and fury. She wrote about Champ, about his gentle nature, his resilience, his unwavering love. She wrote about the shelter, about the indifference of the staff, the cold efficiency of the system. She wrote about injustice, neglect, and cruelty. She poured her heart and soul into that post, her tears blurring the words on the screen. When she was finished, she hesitated for a moment, her finger hovering over the publish button. Was she doing the right thing? Would anyone even care? But then she thought of Champ, his sad eyes, his gentle spirit. She owed it to him, to his memory, to tell his story. She clicked the button, and the post went live. Sarah didn't expect much of a response. She had a small circle of online friends, mostly fellow bookworms and cat lovers. But within hours, her post had been shared hundreds of times. Comments poured in, messages of support, outrage, and shared grief. People were touched by Champ's story, by Sarah's courage in speaking out. They shared their own experiences with animal shelters, their own stories of loss and frustration. The post went viral, spreading across social media platforms, reaching news outlets and animal welfare organizations. Sarah's inbox was flooded with messages from reporters, activists, and ordinary people who wanted to help. She was interviewed by local newspapers and TV stations, her story becoming a symbol of the fight against animal cruelty and neglect. She was contacted by animal rights groups who offered her support and guidance, and she was contacted by people who had adopted animals from Happy Tales, people who were now questioning the shelter's practices and demanding answers. The public outcry was swift and fierce. Protests were organized outside Happy Tales, with people holding signs and chanting slogans demanding justice for Champ and better treatment for the animals in the shelter's care. The shelter's management, caught off guard by the negative publicity, issued a statement defending their actions, claiming that they followed all applicable regulations and that euthanasia was a necessary part of shelter operations. But their words rang hollow in the face of Sarah's heartfelt testimony and the growing public outrage. The local authorities launched an investigation into the shelter's practices, and several employees, including Mrs. Jenkins, were placed on administrative leave. The shelter's reputation was in tatters, its future uncertain. Sarah watched these developments with a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. She had never intended to cause so much upheaval, but she knew that Champ's story had sparked a much-needed conversation about animal welfare and the responsibility of shelters to provide compassionate care. And as she read the messages of support from people all over the country, she realized that she was not alone in her fight. There were others who shared her passion, her determination to make a difference in the lives of animals. The investigation into Happy Tales Animal Shelter dragged on for weeks. Its findings splashed across local news with increasing regularity. Sarah, now a reluctant spokesperson for Champ and the countless animals who had passed through the shelter's doors, found herself thrust into the spotlight. She attended rallies, gave interviews, and even spoke before the city council, her voice gaining strength with each public appearance. The shelter, meanwhile, was crumbling under the weight of scrutiny. Donations dried up, adoption rates plummeted, and volunteers, once plentiful, became scarce. Mrs. Jenkins, stripped of her authority and facing possible legal action, became a recluse, her reign of rigid routine and cold calculations over. One crisp autumn afternoon, Sarah received a call from a reporter she'd spoken with previously. "They're closing down," the reporter informed her, a hint of triumph in her voice. "Happy Tales is finished. They're surrendering their license and transferring the remaining animals to other shelters." Sarah felt a wave of conflicting emotions wash over her. Satisfaction, certainly, that justice had been served, that Champ's suffering had not been in vain, but also a pang of sadness for the staff who would lose their jobs, for the animals who would face further upheaval, and a lingering sense of unease, a premonition that this wasn't truly over. Her instincts proved correct. A few days later, as Sarah was leaving her apartment for a meeting with a local animal rights group, she noticed a dark sedan parked across the street. Two men sat inside, their faces obscured by shadows, but their intent clear. They were watching her. Over the next few days, the harassment escalated. Silent phone calls in the dead of night, threatening notes slipped under her door, her car tires slashed, Fear, a cold knot in her stomach, became her constant companion. She reported the incidents to the police, but they offered little comfort. "We'll keep an eye out," the officer had said with a shrug. But without any concrete evidence, there's not much we can do. Sarah knew who was behind it. Loyalists to the old regime at Happy Tales. Those who blamed her for the shelter's downfall. Perhaps even Mrs. Jenkins herself, clinging to a desperate need for revenge. Fear threatened to paralyze her, to silence her voice. But then she would think of Champ, his trusting eyes, his gentle spirit. She couldn't let them win. She wouldn't let fear silence her. She reached out to her new network of supporters, the animal rights groups, the reporters, the kind strangers who had rallied around her. They responded with an outpouring of support, offering her safe haven, legal assistance, and a chorus of voices to amplify her own. The harassment continued, but its power diminished. Sarah, no longer alone, faced her tormentors with a newfound courage, her voice stronger, her resolve unwavering. She would not be intimidated. She would not back down. The tide began to turn. The increased media attention on Sarah's case, coupled with the unwavering support from animal welfare organizations and the community, put immense pressure on the authorities. The investigation into Happy Tales deepened, uncovering further evidence of neglect and malpractice. Former employees came forward with their own accounts of mistreatment and wrongdoing, their voices adding weight to Sarah's accusations. The police, finally spurred into action, identified the individuals responsible for the harassment. They were, as Sarah suspected, former employees of Happy Tales, disgruntled and embittered by the shelter's closure. They were arrested and charged, their reign of intimidation brought to an abrupt end. With the threat removed and the investigation concluding, a sense of calm descended upon Sarah. The fear that had haunted her for weeks gradually subsided, replaced by a quiet sense of triumph. She had faced her adversaries, endured their attacks, and emerged stronger. Her voice amplified by the chorus of support surrounding her. The story of Champ, the old German shepherd who had touched so many hearts, became a catalyst for change. The city council, spurred by public pressure, passed stricter regulations for animal shelters, ensuring better care and oversight. New shelters opened, run by compassionate individuals dedicated to animal welfare, and a renewed sense of awareness permeated the community. A recognition that every animal, young or old, healthy or infirm, deserved compassion and respect. Sarah, no longer just a grieving pet owner, found herself at the forefront of this movement. She became a sought-after speaker, sharing Champ's story at conferences and community events. She worked with animal rescue organizations, fostering dogs in need and finding them loving homes. And she even started her own blog, Champ's Legacy, a platform to advocate for animal rights and share stories of hope and resilience. One sunny afternoon, Sarah found herself back at the park where she had buried Champ. The oak tree under which he rested had shed its leaves, their vibrant colors carpeting the ground like a mosaic. She knelt beside his grave, her fingers tracing the inscription on the simple headstone. "Champ, a loyal friend. You changed everything, Champ," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You made a difference." As she stood up to leave, she noticed a young couple approaching, a small child in tow. They stopped at a nearby bench and the child, a little girl with bright eyes and a mischievous grin, ran towards the oak tree. She knelt beside Champ's grave, her tiny hand reaching out to touch the headstone. Sarah watched, a smile spreading across her face. Champ's legacy lived on, not just in her heart, but in the hearts of others, inspiring compassion, sparking change, and reminding everyone that even the smallest voice can make a world of difference.